Hello, human geographers. We are back at it again. Tonight, we begin our conversation on ethnicity. But tonight's lecture is going to cut across multiple units, including culture, population and migration, political geography, urban and rural geography. There's a lot to potentially look at. So let's start by talking about identity. Identity is how we make sense of ourselves. Human identity is dynamic and can change. It's contingent on where we are geographically and by scale, but also when we are identifying from a temporal standpoint. It depends on who we are with. Identities are both individual as well as collective and can be nested one inside of another. So classifying how people identify is difficult and often tends to exaggerate the differences between people, particularly visible differences. So, for example, I could say, my name's Matt, and I'm from planet Earth. I've also lived in Michigan, but I'm a proud Nevadan of Irish and Lithuanian descent. I'm a husband and a father, but also a teacher for the Cougar Nation. I'm an American, but I'm also from a weird society. That is, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And while much of this is true for my younger brother as well, does he necessarily identify the same way or in the same order? So think about the identities that you associate with. Two major categories that are often discussed when it comes to identity are ethnicity and race. Ethnicity is identity with a group of people that share a common ancestry and culture. The word ethnic is derived from the Greek word ethnos, meaning a people or nation. An ethnic group consists of people of common ancestry and cultural traditions, which we could call a shared cultural heritage. This shared cultural heritage called ethnicity may include characteristics such as belief and value systems, language, religion, food and clothing, history, and common experiences or a shared ancestral homeland. And these cultural traditions can mean different things for different ethnic groups. For some, such as Jews, ethnicity may center on religion. For the Amish, it could be cultural practices as well as religion. For Swiss Americans, it may be national origin. For German Americans, a common ancestral language. For African Americans, it may be a shared history associated with slavery. Ethnicity has internal personal components as well as external behavioral components. And ethnicity is subjective. For example, a person whose father is Peruvian and whose mother is Japanese might consider herself to be ethnically Japanese, ethnically Peruvian, a hybrid of both, or none of them. It's subjective and flexible. But the basis for ethnicity is culture. Race, on the other hand, is identity with a group of people descended from a biological ancestor. But there is a second definition. A categorization of humans based on skin color and other physical characteristics. Racial categories are social and political constructions because they are based on ideas that some biological differences, especially skin color, are more important than others, like height, even though the latter might have actually had more significance in terms of human history. The idea of race is a much more recent one than that of ethnicity, and especially gained traction as European colonialism began an intense process of globalization. A Swedish naturalist initially identified 4 groups of people inhabiting the earth based on the single trait of skin color. And subsequent individuals have said that there were as few as 3 races, and others have argued that there are 30 or more. But the reality is this. There is no biological basis for dividing the human species into 4 or 5 groups based on skin color. Most scholars believe that all human beings are, genetically speaking, members of only one race, Homo sapiens. Simply stated, racial categories are subjective and arbitrary. When people are divided into so-called races, the amount of genetic variation within a single race turns out to be much greater than the variation between races. For example, skin color is often used because it is a visible characteristic. But skin color is not a reliable indicator of genetic closeness. Indigenous peoples of southern India, New Guinea, and Australia are about as dark-skinned as Native Africans. But Native Africans, Southern Indians, and Aboriginal Australians are not closely related genetically. So when we refer to race, we are talking about a combination of physical attributes that may include differences in skin, eye, and hair color. It has also included things like eye shape, bone structure, and hair texture. And unlike ethnicity, which is a cultural tradition that people typically self-identify with, race is an identity that is more often assigned based on those external physical characteristics. Boundaries between races are always arbitrary. They're not fixed, scientifically determined biological categories, but rather are based on how different groups of people view themselves and others. So you might be wondering, if there isn't a biological basis for race, why are we talking about it then? It's important to note, race is a social construct. So social scientists are interested in studying its impact on society. And because of the importance race and ethnicity has on our perceptions of the world, geographers are interested in understanding their spatial distribution. The reality is that race and ethnicity arise from multiple sources. Your own definition of yourself, your cultural traditions, and your ancestry, but also the way others see you and the way society treats you, particularly legally. As human geographers, we're interested in understanding how race and ethnicity relate spatially to a wide range of variables, such as consumer needs, income and housing, levels of education, health, crime, exposure to environmental hazards, and many other aspects of our lives. And different ethnic or racial groups may leave different imprints on the landscape. One can have diverse sensory experiences by seeing different types of architecture, businesses and products, languages on signs, the soundscapes of traffic, smells of food, and so much more. Now that we understand the difference between ethnicity and race, let's talk about their spatial distribution. Globally, most census questions focus on ethnicity, which tends to examine distinct cultural traditions within a country. But the US is one of a handful of exceptions in that our census asks separate questions about ethnicity and race. You can see them here. So keep in mind that while we're talking about the spatial distribution of different groups in the United States, the data is often combined between ethnicity and race. A little background behind these questions. Prior to 1960, census takers would determine which category to put people in. Since 1960, people have been able to record the group that they most strongly self-identify with. And before 2000, the United States Census classified Hispanic as a race. Therefore, a white person from Mexico, a black person from Brazil, and a native person from Bolivia were all classified as Hispanic. In 2000, though, the census recognized that Hispanic is not a race and that it's better defined as an ethnicity based on culture. But the word Hispanic means coming from a country whose culture derives from Spain or Spanish origins. So the term Hispanic excludes people from Latin America whose culture derives from Portugal, like Brazilians, but also indigenous populations. So some people prefer the term Latina or Latino, and beginning in 2010, the census adopted Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin to describe the Hispanic ethnicity. Also in 2000, respondents were able to choose one or more races. So let's look at our numbers. White, based on the race question from the census, and non-Hispanic, derived from the ethnicity question, constitute a majority of the population in the United States, at least for the moment. It is projected that by 2042, white non-Hispanic will represent less than 50% of the US population, with the smaller racial or ethnic groups combining to represent more than 50%. The largest minority group in the United States is Hispanic or Latino. African Americans used to be the second largest group in the United States, but were passed in 2003 and now are the third largest group. Asian Americans come in just shy of 6% based on the 2020 census numbers. Two or more races are at almost 3%, and American Indians coming in at just over 1%. So let's take a look at the spatial distribution of ethnic groups in the United States. We'll start by asking, what type of map are we looking at? And what is our scale of analysis? Very good. It is a choropleth map at the county scale. And what we're looking at is the largest group in each county, with the shading of the choropleth classes being based on the county numbers relative to national averages. So we can see that the white non-Hispanic population represents the largest group in the United States. In most counties, they are the largest group. But that population has fallen steadily from nearly 90% in the first half of the 20th century to just under 80% of the US population in 1980, and finally to about 60% in 2020. States that have a high proportion of whites are the result of early immigration and settlement patterns that came predominantly from Europe. But between 2000 and 2014, the white non-Hispanic population fell in every state. This decline can be attributed to a couple of things. Low fertility rates amongst white population. The TFR for white non-Hispanic women is 1.71 children, well below replacement, as well as immigration of non-whites from other countries. This is that same map, but now we're looking at the largest of the minority groups in each county. So in other words, we have removed the majority group, the white non-Hispanic group, and now we're looking at the largest group in each county. So, what kind of patterns do you notice? What do you notice about the different ethnic groups? Hispanic and Latino are represented by green on this map. African Americans are blue. Asians are red. And Native or indigenous populations are purple. So what do you notice? Make some observations. So now let's take a look at our individual minority groups. We start with the largest minority group in the United States, which is Hispanic or Latino. The Hispanic population grew from 4.6% of the US population in 1980 to 18% in 2015. So how would you describe the spatial distribution you see here? Is it clustered or dispersed? Where would you see high density? How about low density? Latin America and Asia, rather than Europe, are now the principal sources of immigrants to North America. In 2010, Mexico alone supplied nearly a quarter of all immigrants to the United States. The two largest national origin groups of Hispanic immigrants are Mexicans and Cubans. Mexicans and Central Americans largely immigrate to California and Texas, while Cubans and Puerto Ricans have immigrated to Florida. New York also has a large number of Latino immigrants, particularly from Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic. The largest Hispanic clusters are in states along the southern border, such as California, Texas, and Florida, as well as in New York. California, Texas, and Florida alone account for over 50% of all Hispanic Americans. And while total numbers are telling, California and Texas also have higher percentages of their population that identify as Hispanic, as well as New Mexico. All three of these states have Hispanic populations that constitute over 31% of the state's total population. Hispanics in the United States have the highest fertility rate of all major racial or ethnic groups at 2.53 children per woman. But there's a large difference between generations. First-generation Hispanic immigrants have a fertility rate of 3.35 children, but by the third generation, it falls to 1.98 babies per woman, below replacement. Recently, we've noticed changes in the fastest growing Hispanic populations. They're no longer in the heavily Latino Southwest, but rather in the South, Midwest, as well as other rural areas. As young people from predominantly white rural counties migrate to larger urban areas, they're often replaced by Hispanic immigrants. In the South, many Hispanics hold jobs often seen as undesirable by white or black residents, such as working in poultry plants and picking tomatoes. While in upstate New York, the dairy industry has become heavily dependent on Hispanic immigrants. And while we're largely focusing on quantitative data here, consider the qualitative as well. What elements of culture and of the landscape would you likely see in these regions of high density and high concentration? Consider what we mentioned earlier with businesses, foods, signage, among others that might be present in areas with large Hispanic populations. The Black or African American population has fluctuated around 10 to 12% through most of the 20th century and constitutes about 13% as of 2020. So what do we notice here? Areas of high or low density, areas of high or low concentration. But I want you to also consider differences in total number versus percent. For example, New York and Texas have lower percentages of blacks than do Louisiana or Alabama. However, in terms of total number, both New York and Texas have larger black populations. African slavery constituted the most demographically significant involuntary migration in human history and has strongly shaped the ethnic imprint of the Americas. While slavery ended in 1876 in the United States, Southern blacks faced limited economic opportunities as sharecroppers. This, combined with legal segregation and violence, meant that poverty was difficult to escape and mobility was limited. But as we discussed in our migration unit, the Great Migration that occurred during the early 20th century saw increases in black populations in the North, particularly in cities. But more recently, there has been a reversal of that trend, with many blacks moving back to the South. Let's talk about our Asian American population. Asians made up only 0.2% of the US population through 1950. But by 1980, they constituted 1.5% of the population, and by 2020, almost 6%. So what do we see in this map? Areas of high density or high concentration? What about low density or low concentration? What patterns do you notice? The West Coast is home to about 40% of the Asian population, mostly in California, whereas the urban corridor that stretches from New York City to Boston houses another concentration. In fact, clusters of Asians in urban areas are largely due to the pull factors of metropolitan economies. About 31% of all Asian Americans live in California alone. When viewing this as a percentage of the state population, Hawaii stands out with 36% identifying as Asian, with the next largest concentration being in California with 14%. It should be noted that these percentages do not include Pacific Islanders, whereas this map does include Pacific Islanders with Asian Americans, pushing the Hawaii percentage to well over 50. But Asians are now the fastest growing group in the United States, projected to grow to about 10% of the US population by 2050. This, in fact, despite a fertility rate that is the lowest among all major racial and ethnic groups at 1.66 children per woman, well below the replacement level. Finally, let's look at our indigenous population in the United States. There is no agreed upon definition for indigenous peoples, but three characteristics are commonly cited. First, some kind of ancestral tie to pre-colonial or pre-settler society. Second, self-identification of and acceptance by others as a member of an indigenous group. And third, a non-dominant position, either numerically, economically, or politically. So, what do we notice about our indigenous populations? Are they clustered or dispersed? High density or low? What could explain the pattern on the landscape that we observe here? For example, what might explain why there's a large cluster of Native American people in the Four Corners region? Anything that might explain that pattern? What about the reservation system? Would we see higher density and concentration of Native Americans on or near reservations? As we noticed on the last several slides, there certainly seems to be high concentrations or clusters of different ethnic groups in different areas of the United States. And those concentrations can be for many different reasons, but they also may be in many different types of areas, whether urban, suburban, or rural. At the smallest geographic area, we can identify ethnic enclaves, also known as ethnic neighborhoods, which are found in big city urban areas. These ethnic enclaves are areas with a notable concentration of members of a particular ethnic group, and may vary in size from a few city blocks to sizable districts within a city, such as Chinatown or Little Italy. And they're typically formed by a voluntary community where people of a common ethnicity reside by choice. That's because benefits of an ethnic neighborhood might be the common use of a language, nearby family or friends, think chain migration, stores or services specially tailored to a certain group's taste, and institutions that might be especially important, such as churches or lodges. Traditionally, it was believed that suburbanization diluted ethnic identity, creating a relatively homogeneous suburban culture, a uniform landscape. But as ethnic groups relocated from inner city neighborhoods to the suburbs, residential clustering survived. These suburban ethnic neighborhoods are called ethnoburbs. Probably the best example of an ethnoburb is the San Gabriel Valley near Los Angeles, which has developed as a major Chinese suburb. You can see a picture there. These suburban communities are dotted with ethnic restaurants and stores and celebrate ethnic heritage with festivals, public displays, and educational programs. In rural areas, ethnic concentrations form ethnic islands, which are typically larger in area than ethnic neighborhoods and ethnoburbs. For example, Germanic ethnic islands of people who fled religious persecution continue to exist in the United States, like the Pennsylvania Dutch and the Amish, as well as in Canada with the Mennonites in Alberta. While these areas today are not exclusively of a particular ethnicity, they often maintain a strong ethnic character through festivals, place names, and businesses. And while ethnic enclaves, ethnoburbs, and ethnic islands exist largely by choice, that isn't always the case when it comes to the clustering of ethnic groups. While 75% of all Americans live in urban or suburban areas, nearly 90% of all African Americans and Hispanic Americans do, representing a greater proportion than the average. This is an example of segregation, which is a measure of the degree to which members of a minority group are not uniformly distributed among the total population. Residential segregation is the degree to which two or more groups live separately from one another in different parts of the urban environment. Once again, emphasizing a non-uniform distribution. One way to measure residential segregation is with a dissimilarity index. Essentially, this index provides a score that represents the percentage of people that would have to move to create that uniform distribution. The higher the score, the more segregated the community. Black-white segregation has been declining since it peaked in the 1960s and 70s, but some urban areas like Detroit, Milwaukee, and New York, as of 2010, still had dissimilarity scores of over 79, meaning that more than 79% of all the black population would have to move in order to reach full integration. In fact, Detroit represents about 10% of Michigan's total population, but 50% of their African American population. However, in Las Vegas, the score was 36, representing very little segregation between blacks and whites. Hispanic-white segregation is less dramatic, but the city with the greatest residential segregation for Hispanics was New York City, with 40% of the state population living in New York City, but 75% of the Hispanic population living there. Baltimore is one of the least segregated cities for Hispanics. The residential segregation between whites and Asian Americans is lower than both African Americans and Hispanic Americans. So why does residential segregation persist in some places and not in others? In some of the most segregated cities, people know where the other groups live and will purposely choose to live in neighborhoods with people like themselves. Real estate agents and community leaders may consciously or subconsciously direct people to their own neighborhood. Practices like redlining, while illegal now, were once used to create segregated communities. We'll discuss that later this year. In what is known as white flight, many whites moved to suburbs due to concerns over changing property values, crime rates, and school quality, as well as discriminatory practices like blockbusting, where real estate agents tried to scare them to sell their property at lower values so they could then turn around and sell it to a black family for a significantly higher cost. That's because U.S. average incomes vary by race and ethnicity, making it difficult to afford to move into a more expensive neighborhood that's also populated by another race. But segregation and clustering can also occur from a desire to be with one's own group, which is especially true for new immigrants, as well as Orthodox Hasidic Jewish communities, who often isolate themselves to ensure that the community follows the established religious traditions. The reality is that it is difficult to disentangle how much residential segregation is due to personal preference and how much is due to a sensation of discrimination. A historical example of racial segregation occurred in South Africa and was known as apartheid, meaning apartness or separateness. We define it as laws that are no longer in effect in South Africa that physically separated different races into different geographic areas. Here was the background. Southern Africa was already home to numerous different African cultural groups when Dutch settlers arrived in Cape Town in 1652. These settlers called themselves Boers, from a Dutch term meaning farmer. Today, South Africans of Dutch descent usually call themselves Afrikaners, from Afrikaans, the name of the Dutch-derived language that they speak. Toward the end of the 18th century, British settlers moved into the area. Later, the British shipped Indian laborers in from their colonies in South Asia to work on sugar plantations. South Africa had a majority black population, but when South Africa gained independence in 1910, they instituted a policy of white minority rule. This was formalized under the apartheid system in 1948. When apartheid was formalized, it created 4 racial classes that were identified. White, or those of European descent, Indian, sometimes called Asian, black, which included many different ethnic groups, and colored, for those who had mixed ancestry. Under apartheid, each racial group had to have its own geographic space. The legislation authorized the creation of black homelands called Bantustans. Many black South Africans were employed in the primary sector, but many others worked as housekeepers or construction workers in cities, which were generally white. So black residential areas called townships formed on the outer edges of South African cities. These were slums. Apartheid also segregated public facilities, including restrooms, drinking fountains, schools, and beaches. Apartheid officially ended in 1991, but it did not end peacefully. In 1994, all South African adults were allowed to vote. Nelson Mandela, a key figure in the anti-apartheid movement, was elected as the first black president. And while apartheid is over, its legacy is still felt. For example, unemployment is nearly 7 times higher for black South Africans than for white South Africans. Apartheid is one historical example of how segregation and violence can occur from animosity between racial or ethnic groups. I want to finish tonight by defining a couple of terms that we'll examine more closely in class. Ethnocentrism is evaluating other cultures based exclusively on the perspective of one's own culture. Essentially, it's evaluating another's culture using the standards and expectations of our own. Racism, on the other hand, is the belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. So racism establishes a sense of superiority attached to physical characteristics. Ethnic cleansing is a process in which a more powerful ethnic group forcibly removes a less powerful one in order to create an ethnically homogeneous region. This can be through forced migrations, as we saw with apartheid and the creation of homelands, but also through violence. Violence against racial or ethnic minorities has unfortunately occurred for thousands of years and continues to this day. Persecution of Jews is one example. Go back to the Roman Empire some 2,000 years ago. Then there were periods of violence against Jews in Spain, in England, in Germany during the 14th century, Russia during the 19th century, as well as the Holocaust during World War II. The Holocaust is an example of a genocide, the mass killing of a group of people in an attempt to eliminate the entire group from existence. We will be looking at several different examples of ethnic cleansing and genocide in class. It will not be an easy conversation, but it will provide us with context and examples that we will continue to use as we begin our discussion on political geography. I'll see everyone back in class.